The shadows stretch long across the fjord as the sun dips below the horizon. A line of sleek wooden vessels cuts through the mist-shrouded water, their dragon-headed prows emerging like phantoms from the gloom. The oars rise and fall in perfect rhythm, moved by the strength of men whose lives have been shaped by the harsh northern seas. This is not merely a journey, it is the beginning of a military revolution that would reshape the political landscape of medieval Europe. The Vikings were about to demonstrate a form of warfare so rapid, so unexpected, and so devastating that established kingdoms would tremble at the mere rumor of their approach. Before we begin this journey into the Viking Age, tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? It's always fascinating to see our community of history lovers spread across the world. And if you're new here, don't forget to subscribe and enable notifications. Every subscription helps us keep exploring the real stories behind the legends. Now let's begin. The world of 8th century Europe existed in a delicate balance of power. The Frankish Empire under Charlemagne had established itself as the dominant force on the continent, while Anglo-Saxon England had settled into a patchwork of kingdoms with their own systems of defense. Across the European mainland, settlements had grown accustomed to a certain predictability in warfare. Armies would march, positions would be taken, and battles would be fought according to understood rhythms of conflict. Monasteries and trading centers grew wealthy, often protected only by their sacred status or the assumption that warfare followed certain unspoken rules. These communities nestled along riverbanks and coastlines, their treasures stored in wooden chests and stone vaults, their defenses minimal, their guards few. They had no reason to suspect that from the north would come warriors who operated outside all conventional understanding of how war should be conducted. In the cold reaches of Scandinavia, a different reality had shaped a different approach to conflict. Here, in the lands we now know as Norway, Denmark, and Sweden, communities lived scattered along deeply cut coastlines and among snow-covered mountains. The harsh climate permitted only limited agriculture, pushing communities to master the sea as a source of sustenance and connection. For generations, these northerners had developed increasingly sophisticated vessels, boats that could navigate both the treacherous open ocean and the shallow inland waterways. The famous longship was no sudden invention, but rather the culmination of centuries of maritime evolution. With a shallow draft that allowed navigation in waters barely a meter deep, a symmetrical design that enabled it to reverse direction without turning around, and a combination of sail and oar power, these vessels represented the perfect fusion of technology and purpose. Life in the north demanded versatility. Every free man was a farmer, a hunter, a trader, and a warrior when circumstances required. These men carried their weapons as commonly as modern people carry phones, the sword or axe, an extension of their identity and social standing. From childhood, they trained in combat, not as specialized soldiers, but as members of a society where survival often depended on martial skill. Their social structure valorized personal courage and martial prowess, with sagas and poems celebrating the deeds of those who showed exceptional bravery in combat. Unlike the professional armies of southern Europe, these northern warriors fought not for pay or feudal obligation, but for personal wealth, reputation, and the bonds of loyalty to their chieftains. The longship represented more than just a technological innovation. It embodied a fundamentally different approach to warfare. Traditional European armies were constrained by the need to transport supplies, siege equipment, and large numbers of men over land. Campaigns were slow, methodical affairs, limited by the seasons and the logistics of feeding thousands. The Vikings, by contrast, carried their mobility with them. A longship could transport between 30 and 60 warriors, along with their weapons and sufficient supplies for extended journeys. Operating in fleets of dozens or sometimes hundreds of vessels, Viking forces could arrive without warning, strike with overwhelming local superiority, and depart before defensive forces could be mustered. The sea and river networks that had served as the highways of European commerce now became the vectors of its vulnerability. What drove these northern people to venture beyond their traditional territories? While popular imagination often portrays the Viking expansion as simply a matter of bloodlust or an inherently warlike culture, the reality was more complex. Demographic pressures played a significant role as population growth strained the limited arable land of Scandinavia. Climate fluctuations in the late 8th century may have further reduced agricultural productivity, pushing communities to seek resources elsewhere. Political developments also contributed. The consolidation of power under ambitious kings in Denmark and Norway limited opportunities for ambitious men within traditional society, driving them to seek wealth and status abroad. For many Norse leaders, foreign expeditions offered a way to gain the wealth needed to maintain their position at home, funding the gift-giving and feasting that cemented their authority. The first recorded Viking raid on Western Europe struck like lightning from a clear sky. In June of 793, a small fleet of longships appeared off the coast of Northumbria in northern England. Their target was the monastery of Lindisfarne, a center of Christian learning and a repository of considerable wealth. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle would later record, "In this year, fierce foreboding omens came over the land of Northumbria. There were immense whirlwinds, lightning storms, and fiery dragons were seen flying in the sky. These signs were followed by great famine, and on June 8th, the ravaging of heathen men destroyed God's church at Lindisfarne through brutal robbery and slaughter. The raid lasted perhaps only hours. The Vikings struck with shocking speed, overwhelming the unprepared monks, seizing valuable relics, and disappearing back to sea before local forces could respond. This was not merely a raid for material gain, it was a demonstration of a new form of warfare for which Europe had no ready answer. What made the Viking hit-and-run tactics so devastatingly effective was their unpredictability. Traditional medieval warfare operated on a seasonal calendar, with campaigns typically launched in spring and concluded before winter. The Viking longships, however, could appear at any time conditions allowed for sailing. Their shallow draft meant they could penetrate deep inland via rivers that had previously been safe from seaborne threats. Coastal lookout systems, where they existed at all, were designed to spot the familiar silhouettes of merchant vessels or warships from neighboring kingdoms. The distinctive profile of the longship soon became a symbol of terror, but initially, these vessels could approach remarkably close to shore before their hostile intent became clear. Even after the initial shock of the early raids had passed, the fundamental problem remained. Defenders could never know where the next strike would fall. Consider the raid on the monastery of Iona off the western coast of Scotland in 795. After the attack on Lindisfarne, one might have expected heightened vigilance throughout the British Isles. Yet the raiders appeared with the same devastating suddenness, suggesting either a complete failure of warning systems or, more likely, the absence of any effective means to track the movement of Viking fleets across open water. The monk Dykweil, writing several decades later, described how the previously peaceful northern islands had been abandoned by their religious communities because of the northern pirates, indicating that even remote locations offered no safety from the reach of the longships. The monastery of Noirmoutier off the French Atlantic coast faced a different experience of Viking raiding. First attacked in 799, it became subject to repeated strikes over subsequent decades. The monks eventually established a routine of seasonal evacuation, withdrawing inland during the summer months when raids were most likely, then returning to their island sanctuary during the winter. This adaptation reveals both the predictability of the raiding season and the complete inability of local authorities to provide protection. The monastery's response, temporary abandonment rather than fortification, speaks to the overwhelming tactical advantage the Vikings maintained in coastal regions. The Vikings approached warfare with a pragmatic efficiency that seemed almost alien to their contemporaries. Medieval European combat often involved elaborate rituals and codes of behavior. Battle was preceded by challenges, parley, and sometimes formal arrangements of troops. The Vikings, by contrast, sought overwhelming advantage whenever possible. They attacked at dawn or in poor weather, when defenders were least prepared. They targeted unfortified settlements with precision, having often scouted them during previous trading visits. If resistance proved stronger than anticipated, they would withdraw rather than sustain unnecessary casualties. This was not cowardice by their cultural standards, but sensible resource management. Dead warriors could not participate in future raids, and the purpose was wealth acquisition, not territorial conquest, at least initially. Archaeological evidence at Repton in England offers intriguing insights into Viking tactical adaptability. When the great heathen army wintered there in 873–874, they converted a Christian church into a defensive structure, surrounding it with a massive D-shaped earthwork that utilized the river as a natural barrier on one side. This transformation of an existing structure into a fortified base demonstrated the Vikings' practical approach to warfare. They recognized the defensive potential of the site and modified it to their needs, incorporating both natural and man-made features into a temporary stronghold from which they could control the surrounding territory. The mechanics of a typical Viking raid followed a consistent pattern that maximized their advantages. Approaching by water, they would select landing sites away from obvious defenses, often beaching their ships on shallow shorelines where larger vessels could not follow. The long ships themselves required no ports or docks. They could be dragged onto beaches and launched again with relative ease. Combat groups would form quickly upon landing, with clear leadership and prearranged signals. Archaeological evidence and saga accounts suggest they typically formed a shield wall, a tight formation of overlapping shields that presented a nearly impenetrable barrier to frontal assault. While maintaining this defensive formation, smaller groups would break off to secure specific objectives or gather portable wealth. The recovery of the Gokstad ship in Norway provided valuable insights into the practical aspects of Viking naval operations. This remarkably well-preserved vessel, dating from around 890 CE, measured 23 meters in length but required only 1 meter of water depth when fully loaded. This shallow draft allowed it to navigate not only coastal waters but also rivers and streams that would be impassable to conventional ships of the period. The ship's construction balanced the need for seaworthiness in open water with the ability to operate in confined spaces, reflecting the dual requirements of long-distance raiding. With space for 32 oarsmen plus additional crew, the Gokstad ship represented the ideal compromise between carrying capacity and operational flexibility. The speed of Viking movement on land continued the advantage established by their naval mobility. Lightly armored compared to later medieval forces, with minimal equipment beyond their weapons and shields, Viking warriors could cover remarkable distances on foot. Contemporary accounts describe their ability to appear where least expected, sometimes striking targets considerable distances from their landing sites. This mobility was not merely physical, but extended to their tactical flexibility. Viking forces could quickly adapt their approach based on the situation they encountered, switching between direct assault, intimidation, and negotiation as circumstances dictated. Their leaders made rapid battlefield decisions without the need for elaborate command structures, giving them a decisive advantage in the chaos of sudden engagement. Eyewitness accounts of Viking attacks emphasize the shock of their sudden appearance. The Annals of Xanten, describing raids along the Rhine in 846, note that the Northmen came to Dorestad and laid it waste. They slaughtered many of the people, taking some captive and burning part of the town. The brevity of this account underscores the lightning nature of the attack. There is no description of prolonged siege or battle, merely the sudden devastating impact of the raiders' arrival and their equally rapid departure. Similar accounts appear repeatedly in chronicles throughout Europe, creating an impression of an enemy that materialized without warning and vanished before effective response could be organized. The experience of Paris during the mid-9th century illustrates how Vikings exploited the limitations of medieval defensive systems. The city was attacked in 845 by a fleet under the legendary leader Ragnar Lothbrok, who sailed up the Seine with apparent ease. Despite having advance warning of the approaching fleet, the Frankish defenses proved inadequate. King Charles the Bald, lacking sufficient forces to confront the raiders directly, resorted to paying a massive tribute of 7,000 pounds of silver to secure their withdrawal. Rather than solving the problem, this payment demonstrated the vulnerability of the kingdom and encouraged further attacks. Paris would be raided again in 856, 861, and most dramatically in 885-886, when a fleet of reportedly 700 ships laid siege to the city for nearly a year. The psychological impact of these tactics cannot be overstated. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle and continental records like the Annals of Saint-Bertin are filled with accounts of terror spreading far beyond the areas directly affected by raids. Communities that had never seen a Viking feared their arrival. Monastic communities relocated precious relics inland. Coastal settlements were abandoned. This fear itself became a weapon in the Viking arsenal. As their reputation spread, mere rumors of approaching longships could induce panic. In some cases, defenders fled without offering resistance, leaving settlements and their wealth unprotected. The Vikings exploited this fear through deliberate acts of spectacular violence against those who resisted, not from mindless brutality, but as calculated demonstrations intended to discourage future opposition. The martyrdom of Saint Edmund provides a vivid example of how Vikings utilized selective violence for psychological effect. According to later accounts, when King Edmund of East Anglia refused to submit to the great heathen army in 869, the Viking leaders Ivar and Ubba subjected him to a ritualized execution, shooting him with arrows before beheading him. While the historical accuracy of these details is uncertain, the story spread widely and contributed to the fearsome reputation of the Norse raiders. Such accounts, whether factual or embellished, serve to amplify the psychological impact of Viking attacks, making resistance seem futile and submission the only rational response. The Irish experience of Viking warfare reveals how raiders adapted their tactics to different environments. Ireland, with its numerous small kingdoms and absence of centralized authority, initially proved highly vulnerable to hit-and-run attacks. The Annals of Ulster record the first raids in 795, noting that the burning of Rechru by the heathens and Skye was plundered and wasted. By 837, Viking forces were operating throughout the island, establishing coastal bases at Dublin, Wexford, Waterford, and Limerick. These long forts, ship fortresses, represented an evolution of raiding tactics, providing secure locations where ships could be protected and plunder stored, allowing for more sustained operations in a region. Dublin, in particular, developed from a seasonal base into a permanent settlement that dominated trade in the Irish Sea region. How did established powers respond to this unprecedented threat? Initially, poorly. Traditional defensive systems were organized around fixed fortifications and responses to conventional armies. Local forces might be substantial on paper, but were slow to mobilize and often arrived long after the raiders had departed. The earliest effective responses came from communities that adapted to the new reality. Coastal watchtower networks were established or enhanced, providing earlier warning of approaching fleets. Religious communities moved inland or constructed defensive works. Some rulers began creating standing forces that could respond more quickly to raids, though maintaining such forces strained medieval administrative and financial systems. The evolution of European defensive strategy can be traced through the changing pattern of Viking activities. As coastal targets became better protected, raiders pushed further inland via navigable rivers. The Seine, Loire, Rhine, and Elbe became highways for dragon-prowed ships appearing deep in territories that had considered themselves safe from seaborne threats. When local rulers began effectively defending river systems, the Vikings adapted again, establishing temporary bases from which they could conduct operations over wider areas. These bases, sometimes occupied seasonally and sometimes year-round, allowed for more sustained pressure on surrounding territories. What had begun as simple raids gradually evolved into something more complex, a form of systematic extraction, where Viking forces would control an area long enough to gather tribute before moving on. The Chronicles of St. Denis provide a vivid account of how these tactics affected the Frankish Empire. The number of ships grows larger. The endless flood of Vikings never ceases to increase. Everywhere, Christians are the victims of massacres, burnings, plunderings. The Vikings conquer all in their path. Rouen is laid waste, pillaged and burned. Paris, Beauvais, Saint-Denis, Meaux, Melun, Chartres, Évreux, Bayeux, and all towns of note. No monastery remains unviolated, no village unsacked. While accounts written by the victims of these raids undoubtedly contain elements of exaggeration, archaeological evidence confirms widespread destruction at many sites during this period. The hit-and-run tactics had evolved from isolated incidents into a systematic challenge to the established order. The archaeological record at sites like Dorestad in the Netherlands reveals the material impact of repeated Viking raids. Once a thriving trading center at the mouth of the Rhine, Dorestad was attacked multiple times between 834 and 863. Excavations have uncovered layers of burning and destruction, followed by periods of rebuilding, creating a physical chronicle of the settlement's struggle to survive under persistent raiding pressure. The eventual abandonment of Dorestad in the late 9th century demonstrates how the cumulative effect of hit-and-run tactics could ultimately render even important economic centers unsustainable when defensive measures proved inadequate. What made the Viking approach to warfare particularly challenging for medieval kingdoms was its fundamental asymmetry. Traditional European warfare was increasingly built around heavily armored cavalry and infantry operating in formation. These forces were expensive to maintain and train, but devastating on the battlefield. The Vikings, however, rarely sought pitched battles unless they held overwhelming advantage. Their tactics were about exploitation of weakness rather than direct confrontation of strength. When faced with superior forces, they simply withdrew to their ships and sought targets elsewhere. This mobility meant that even kingdoms with substantial military resources found themselves in a frustrating game of chase, always arriving where the Vikings had been, never where they were. The Frankish Emperor Charles the Bald expressed this frustration in a letter to Pope Nicholas I in 862. "We are afflicted by the northern peoples who come by ship and plunder everything before them. When we gather our forces to meet them in one place, they flee across the rivers and disperse, only to appear somewhere else. So we fight against them unprepared, caught in disorder, and suffer even greater losses." This imperial complaint captures the essence of the problem. Viking mobility created a permanent tactical advantage that conventional forces struggled to counter. The evolution of Viking tactics over time reflected both their successes and the gradual adaptation of their opponents. The early phase of raiding, characterized by small fleets striking isolated targets, gave way to larger, more coordinated operations. By the mid-9th century, Viking forces were operating in the hundreds of ships and thousands of warriors. The great heathen army that landed in England in 865 represented a significant escalation, bringing together multiple war bands under several leaders in a campaign of conquest rather than mere raiding. This force employed the same tactical principles, speed, surprise, and mobility, but on a strategic scale, moving systematically through the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms and exploiting political divisions. The winter camp established by the Great Heathen Army at Torksey in Lincolnshire in 872-873 has been extensively studied by archaeologists, yielding important insights into the organization of large-scale Viking forces. Metal detector surveys have recovered over 1,000 items, including coins, hack silver, cut pieces of silver used as currency, weights, and trade goods. The diversity of these findings indicates that the army was not merely a military force, but a mobile community that included traders, craftspeople, and possibly families. This composite nature gave the Great Army a self-sufficiency that enhanced its operational flexibility, allowing it to remain in the field for extended periods without requiring external supply lines. The sagas and chronicles give us glimpses of how Viking leaders planned and executed their campaigns. The saga of Ragnar Lodbrok, while containing many legendary elements, describes how leaders would gather intelligence through trading contacts before launching raids. The Viking chieftain Hásteinn, operating in the Mediterranean in the 860s, reportedly disguised his warriors as merchants or even as corpses carried for burial to gain access to walled cities. While some of these accounts may be exaggerated, they reflect the emphasis on deception and psychological warfare that complemented physical tactics. Viking leaders understood that creating confusion and fear multiplied the effectiveness of their relatively small forces. The ability of Viking forces to transition seamlessly between trading and raiding further complicated defensive responses. Many Norse expeditions began as legitimate commercial ventures, with ships carrying trade goods and establishing peaceful contact with local communities. This approach allowed them to gather intelligence about wealth, defenses, and political conditions before deciding whether to initiate hostilities. The boundaries between merchant and raider were fluid in Norse society, with many individuals engaging in both activities as circumstances dictated. This duality created a persistent dilemma for local authorities. Treating all Scandinavians as potential threats would damage valuable trade relationships, yet allowing them free access created serious security vulnerabilities. The technological elements that enabled these tactics extended beyond the famous longships. The Vikings employed a sophisticated system of navigation using sun shadows, natural landmarks, and possibly primitive forms of the sunstone, a crystal that can determine the sun's position even in overcast conditions. This allowed them to undertake open ocean voyages with remarkable precision, appearing off foreign shores with minimal warning. Their weapons were optimized for their style of combat. The typical Viking warrior carried a spear as his primary weapon, supplemented by a sword or axe and protected by a round shield. This equipment balanced the need for offensive capability with the mobility their tactics required. Unlike the increasingly heavy armor of continental forces, most Vikings wore padded garments and perhaps mail shirts, allowing for the rapid movement essential to their approach. Examinations of weapons recovered from Viking graves and battle sites reveal a sophisticated understanding of metallurgy and combat requirements. The Ulfbert swords, produced from exceptionally pure crucible steel, represented the highest quality weapons of their time, combining strength and flexibility in a way that gave their wielders a significant advantage in close combat. Similarly, the distinctive Viking axe evolved to balance cutting power with weight and handling characteristics suited to the shield wall tactics commonly employed. These weapons were not merely tools of war, but valuable possessions that often accompanied their owners to the grave, reflecting the central place of martial prowess in Norse identity. As the 9th century progressed, the pattern of Viking activity underwent a significant transformation. What had begun as seasonal raiding evolved in many regions into permanent settlement. In England, parts of Ireland, Normandy, and the river systems of Russia, Viking forces began to establish year-round bases that gradually developed into new political entities. This transition reflected both the success of their military approach and its limitations. Raiding, however profitable in the short term, provided diminishing returns as targets became better defended and wealth was moved inland. Settlement offered a more sustainable model, allowing Vikings to establish themselves within existing economic systems rather than merely extracting from them. The Viking settlement of Dublin illustrates this evolution from raiding base to established power center. First established as a long fort in 841, Dublin was initially a seasonal base for operations throughout Ireland. Archaeological excavations have revealed how the settlement gradually became more permanent, developing from a fortified camp into a substantial trading town. By the mid-10th century, Dublin was a thriving commercial center with established trading connections throughout the North Sea and Baltic regions. Its rulers, though still culturally Norse, had integrated into Irish political networks through marriage alliances and diplomatic relationships. The raiders had become rulers, maintaining their distinctive identity while adapting to their new environment. The legacy of Viking hit-and-run tactics extended far beyond the immediate impact of their raids. European kingdoms were forced to develop new defensive systems in response to the threat. The Burgall system, established by Alfred the Great of Wessex, created a network of fortified settlements throughout his kingdom, none more than a day's march from the next. These burhs served as defensive strongpoints and administrative centers, fundamentally reshaping the Anglo-Saxon landscape. In France, the threat of Viking raids accelerated the development of feudalism, as central authority delegated defensive responsibilities to local powers who could respond more quickly to attacks. The castle building that would define the European medieval landscape gained significant momentum during this period, partially in response to the Viking threat. Alfred the Great's response to the Viking challenge demonstrates how innovative leadership could counter the advantages of hit-and-run tactics. Ascending to the throne of Wessex in 871, during the height of Viking invasions, Alfred implemented a comprehensive defensive strategy that addressed multiple aspects of the threat. He reorganized the fire militia into a rotating system where half the force remained on duty, while the other half maintained agricultural production. He established the Burgall network to provide both refuge for local populations and bases for counter-operations. Most innovatively, he created a fleet of ships built to his own specifications, designed to counter the Viking longships in their own element. This integrated approach did not eliminate the Viking threat, but it did create a defensive framework that eventually enabled Anglo-Saxon resistance to succeed where other kingdoms had failed. The psychological impact of Viking warfare also had lasting consequences. The speed and unpredictability of their attacks forced communities to develop new forms of resilience and cooperation. Local defensive arrangements became more formalized, with clearer responsibilities for watchkeeping and alarm systems. Religious communities, often the primary targets of raids, developed both better physical defenses and more efficient systems for protecting their treasures. The trauma of the Viking Age remained embedded in European cultural memory long after the raids had ceased, manifesting in literature, folklore, and a persistent association of Northmen with unexpected violence. The Bayeux Tapestry, though depicting events from the Norman conquest of 1066, reveals the enduring military influence of Viking tactics on European warfare. The Normans, themselves descendants of Viking settlers, employed ships remarkably similar to their ancestors' vessels to achieve the same advantage of mobility and surprise in their invasion of England. The tapestry shows how William the Conqueror's forces rapidly established a beachhead and moved inland before organized resistance could materialize, a tactical approach that would have been familiar to the Viking raiders of 2 centuries earlier. Though Norman warfare had incorporated elements of Frankish heavy cavalry tactics, the basic principles of speed and decisive action remained central to their success. For the Vikings themselves, the success of their tactics brought wealth, land, and new opportunities. But it also brought profound cultural change as they established permanent settlements among the peoples they had once raided. In Normandy, the descendants of Viking settlers adopted French language and customs within a generation, while maintaining elements of their northern identity. In England, the Danelaw became a region of cultural fusion, where Norse and Anglo-Saxon traditions merged to create new social patterns. In Dublin, York, and other trading centers, former raiders became merchants, gradually integrated into wider economic networks. The very mobility that had made the Vikings so formidable as raiders facilitated their eventual assimilation as settlers. The assimilation process in Normandy demonstrates how rapidly Viking identity could transform when the context changed from raiding to ruling. In 911, the Viking leader Rollo received the territory later known as Normandy from the Frankish king Charles the Simple, in exchange for defending the region against further raids. Within a single generation, Rollo's followers had largely abandoned Norse language for French and had converted to Christianity. By the time of the Norman conquest in 1066, the descendants of Vikings had become culturally Frankish, though they maintained certain distinctive traditions and a reputation for military prowess. This rapid adaptation suggests that Viking identity was always more fluid and pragmatic than later Romantic interpretations would suggest. The transition from raiding to settlement was neither uniform nor complete. Even as some Viking groups established permanent territories, others continued the pattern of seasonal raiding. The diversity of Viking activity reflected the decentralized nature of Norse society. There was no single Viking strategy, but rather numerous war bands and chieftains pursuing their own objectives. Some leaders, like Rollo in Normandy, negotiated formal agreements with existing powers, exchanging military service for land. Others, like Ivar the Boneless in England, pursued conquest and direct rule. The flexibility that characterized Viking tactics extended to their political arrangements, allowing them to adapt to vastly different circumstances across Europe. The distinctive characteristics of Viking settlements in different regions reflect this diversity of approaches. In England's Danelaw, Norse settlers integrated into existing agricultural patterns while maintaining their own legal customs, creating a hybrid society. In Ireland, Viking influence remained largely concentrated in coastal towns that functioned primarily as trade centers, with limited impact on the rural hinterland. In Russia, Scandinavian warriors known as Rus established a political elite that gradually merged with the local Slavic population, creating the foundation for the first Russian state. Each of these settlement patterns built upon the initial advantage created by hit-and-run tactics, but developed according to local conditions and opportunities. The saga of Egil Skallagrimsson provides insight into how individual Vikings navigated this changing world. Egil was both a poet and a warrior, participating in raids across the North Sea, but also engaging in trade and politics. The saga describes how he and his brother would go Viking in the summers, a phrase that treated raiding as a seasonal occupation while maintaining their farm in Iceland. This pattern, multiplied across thousands of Norse warriors, created a persistent threat that established kingdoms struggled to counter. Individual war bands might be defeated or bought off, but the decentralized nature of Viking activity meant that new groups were constantly entering the field. The story of Egil also illuminates how Viking activity appeared from the Norse perspective. For Egil, raiding was simply one aspect of a complex life that included farming, trade, poetry, and political maneuvering. His expeditions were not driven by bloodlust or some inherent cultural predisposition toward violence, but by the pursuit of wealth and reputation in a society where these qualities determined one's place in the social hierarchy. The saga depicts him making rational calculations about where to raid based on intelligence about potential targets, and choosing to engage in peaceful trade when this seemed more profitable. This pragmatic approach to violence as a means rather than an end characterized the Viking worldview and helps explain the adaptability of their tactics. By the late 10th century, the nature of Viking warfare had evolved significantly. The raiders who had once struck and disappeared were increasingly engaged in territorial conquest and conventional warfare. In England, Danish kings Sweyn Forkbeard and later Nut would conquer the entire kingdom, not through hit-and-run tactics but through sustained campaigns and political maneuvering. These later Vikings commanded professional forces that resembled the armies of their opponents far more than the raid parties of earlier generations. The tactical advantages that had made the initial Viking expansion so successful, surprise, mobility, and unpredictability, were gradually neutralized as European powers adapted and the Vikings themselves became part of the established order. The campaigns of Sweyn Forkbeard against England of 1003 to 14 demonstrate how far Viking warfare had evolved from its raiding origins. Sweyn led a substantial army with clear political objectives, the conquest of a kingdom rather than mere plunder. His forces operated in sustained campaigns rather than brief raids, maintaining field presence through winters rather than returning to Scandinavia. Though his fleet gave him significant mobility advantages, he engaged in conventional sieges of defended towns and sought pitched battles when advantageous. This approach reflected both the increased resources available to Scandinavian rulers and their integration into the broader European political system. Sweyn's son Cnut would complete this evolution, ruling England as a conventional Christian monarch while maintaining his Danish territories. The climactic period of Viking activity came in the early 11th century, when Cnut the Great established an empire encompassing England, Denmark, Norway, and parts of Sweden. This achievement represented both the pinnacle of Viking success and the transformation of Norse warriors from raiders to rulers. Cnut governed as a Christian king, adopting many of the administrative practices of the Anglo-Saxon monarchy. His empire, though short-lived, demonstrated how thoroughly the descendants of raiders had integrated into the European political framework. The hit-and-run tactics that had once terrified continental populations had given way to conventional statecraft and governance. Cnut's reign in England, 1016 to 1035, illustrates the complete transformation from raiding to ruling. Though he had gained the throne through military conquest, Cnut quickly recognized the need to establish legitimacy through conventional channels. He married Emma of Normandy, widow of the previous Anglo-Saxon king Ethelred, creating dynastic continuity. He maintained much of the existing administrative structure, retaining many Anglo-Saxon nobles in positions of authority. He cultivated relationships with the church, making substantial donations to religious institutions. These actions demonstrate how thoroughly the imperatives of governance had replaced the opportunistic approach of raiding. Cnut's famous demonstration that he could not command the tide is perhaps symbolic of this transition, from the fluid, opportunistic tactics of raiding to the recognition of natural and political limitations that comes with settled rule. What eventually brought the Viking Age to a close was not military defeat, but a combination of factors that made raiding less attractive and settlement more permanent. The Christianization of Scandinavia altered the cultural dynamics that had supported raiding, introducing new moral frameworks and connecting northern kingdoms to wider European diplomatic networks. Improved defenses throughout Europe reduced the profitability of traditional raiding patterns. The consolidation of power in Scandinavia itself created stronger central authorities that directed military resources towards state-building rather than independent expeditions. By the mid-11th century, the era of classic Viking raiding had largely passed, though Norse influence remained embedded in many European regions. The gradual Christianization of Scandinavia between the late 10th and early 12th centuries fundamentally altered the cultural context that had supported raiding. Early missionary efforts had limited success, but the conversion of kings like Harald Bluetooth of Denmark, c. 965, and Olaf Tryggvason of Norway, c. 995, began a top-down process of religious change. Christianity introduced moral prohibitions against attacking co-religionists and established institutional connections between Scandinavian rulers and the broader European political system. While these changes did not immediately end all raiding activity, they did alter the relationship between Scandinavia and its neighbors, gradually transforming former raiders into trading partners and political allies. The echoes of Viking hit-and-run tactics would resonate long after the dragon-headed ships disappeared from European waters. Naval mobility would remain a significant military advantage throughout history, from the Portuguese caravels that enabled global empire building to the aircraft carriers of modern navies. The psychological impact of unpredictable, highly mobile forces would be rediscovered repeatedly by military strategists, from the Mongol horsemen who swept across Asia to modern special operations forces. The fundamental principle that the Vikings had employed so effectively, that mobility creates opportunities to strike where the enemy is weakest, remains a cornerstone of military thinking. The Mongol campaigns of the 13th century, while operating in a very different geographical context, employed tactical principles remarkably similar to those of the Vikings. Utilizing the superior mobility of their mounted forces, Mongol armies could appear suddenly at vulnerable points, strike with overwhelming local superiority, and withdraw before effective resistance could be organized. Like the Vikings, they created widespread psychological terror that magnified their military effectiveness. The parallel suggests that certain tactical approaches emerge independently when similar conditions exist. In both cases, a mobile warrior society encountering more settled, wealthy, but less adaptable civilizations. In our modern understanding of the Vikings, popular culture has often emphasized the violence of their raids while overlooking the sophisticated tactical thinking that made them successful. Archaeological discoveries continue to revise our understanding of both their technology and their society. Excavations of Viking ships at Roskilde and elsewhere have revealed vessels of remarkable sophistication, optimized through generations of experience for the specific conditions of northern waters. Settlements at Dublin, York, and Jorvik have shown how quickly raiders could transition to traders when circumstances favored it. The image of the Viking as merely a brutal berserker has given way to a more nuanced appreciation of their adaptability and strategic thinking. The discovery of the Oseberg ship in Norway in 1904 revolutionized scholarly understanding of Viking naval technology. This magnificently preserved vessel, dating from approximately 820 CE, featured exquisite wood carving and sophisticated construction techniques that demonstrated a level of craftsmanship far beyond what was previously attributed to Norse shipbuilders. Subsequent discoveries, including the Gokstad and Thun ships, have further enhanced our appreciation of Viking maritime capabilities. These vessels were not crude war canoes, but precisely engineered craft that represented the height of medieval naval technology, combining speed, durability, and operational flexibility in a way that no other contemporary ships could match. For contemporary societies, the Viking Age offers valuable lessons about resilience and adaptation. The European communities that successfully weathered the storm of Norse raids were those that developed new defensive systems and social organizations in response to the threat. The Anglo-Saxon kingdoms under Alfred the Great and his successors implemented systematic reforms that made their territories more resistant to the Viking approach. These included not only physical defenses, but also administrative innovations that allowed for more effective resource mobilization. The ability to adapt in the face of fundamentally new challenges remains relevant in our own era of rapid technological and social change. The discovery of a Viking camp at Repton, England, excavated beginning in the 1970s, has provided tangible evidence of how Norse forces operated during extended campaigns. The Great Heathen Army wintered there in 873-874, converting a church into a defensive structure and constructing a substantial earthwork enclosure. The archaeological evidence includes not only weapons and typical warrior equipment, but also tools for ship repair, evidence of metalworking, and artifacts associated with women and domestic activities. This suggests that even during military campaigns, Viking forces maintained the technical capabilities to repair their equipment and possibly included non-combatant specialists who supported the warriors. This combination of military and technical capability enhanced their operational independence and made their forces more adaptable than the conventional armies they faced. The legacy of Viking hit-and-run tactics extends into unexpected areas of modern life. The emphasis on mobility, surprise, and targeted strikes that characterized Norse raiding has parallels in contemporary business disruption, where new entrants to markets can use asymmetric approaches to challenge established competitors. The Viking longship, a technological innovation that opened entirely new strategic possibilities, has its echoes in the transformative technologies of our own time. Even the Norse pattern of seasonal raiding followed by return to agricultural work reflects a kind of portfolio approach to risk that remains relevant in modern economic thinking. Recent archaeological work at the Viking settlement of L'Anse aux Meadows in Newfoundland, Canada, has refined our understanding of how far the Norse maritime capabilities extended. Established around 1000 CE, this site represents the only confirmed Viking presence in North America. The settlement was apparently short-lived, lasting perhaps only a decade, but its existence demonstrates the extraordinary range of Viking exploration. The journey from Greenland to Newfoundland required crossing open ocean far from sight of land, a navigational achievement that would not be replicated by Europeans for another 5 centuries. This extension of Viking influence to a new continent represents the ultimate expression of the mobility that had made their hit-and-run tactics so effective in European waters. As the light fades from our journey through this turbulent age, we can look back and see the Viking phenomenon not as an isolated historical curiosity, but as a case study in how relatively small groups can create outsized impacts through innovation and adaptability. The Norse raiders who appeared so suddenly on the horizons of 8th century Europe brought not only destruction, but also cultural exchange, new trading networks, and ultimately fresh energy to the societies they encountered. Their tactics were revolutionary not because of inherent superiority, but because they operated outside the established frameworks of European warfare, exploiting assumptions and vulnerabilities that had previously gone unrecognized. The shores of history are littered with the remains of societies that failed to adapt to new challenges. The Viking Age demonstrates both the vulnerability of established systems to unexpected threats and the capacity of human communities to develop new responses when forced by necessity. The monasteries that were such tempting targets in the early raids gradually developed defenses or relocated inland. The kingdoms that initially seemed helpless before the swiftness of Norse attacks eventually created new military and administrative structures that blunted their effectiveness. And the Vikings themselves evolved from raiders to settlers, traders, and ultimately contributors to the complex tapestry of European civilization. Today, as we look across the mist-shrouded fjords and imagine the sleek longships setting out for distant shores, we can appreciate the Viking Age not simply as a time of violence and disruption, but as a period of dynamic change and cultural exchange. The dragon-headed prows that once struck terror into coastal communities have become symbols of adventure and exploration. The hit-and-run tactics that overwhelmed early medieval defenses have been studied by military strategists for generations. And the Norse warriors who wielded those tactics with such devastating effect have been transformed in our cultural memory from simple marauders to complex historical actors navigating a changing world with ingenuity and courage. Their story reminds us that history is not a simple tale of heroes and villains, but a constantly shifting landscape where innovation, adaptation, and human agency shape the course of events in ways that continue to resonate across the centuries.